Have you ever found yourself standing at a silent crossroads? A moment so private, so untraceable, that no one would ever know which path you chose. No cameras, no witnesses, no one to judge or applaud you. Just you and your own heart. Now imagine this. You discover a wallet on a deserted street at midnight. No security cameras, no pedestrians, no chance of being caught. Inside is a thick stack of cash, enough to pay off your debts, buy something you've been dreaming about, or make a problem disappear. No one would ever know if you kept it. Would you? Most people like to believe they do the right thing. But the truth is, when temptation whispers and no one's watching, that's when the real battle begins. Not a battle against the world, but a quiet war within yourself. This is where the ancient wisdom of Buddhism speaks louder than any modern self-help book. Because Buddhism doesn't just ask what you do when others are watching. It asks, who are you when no one is? In the old Pali scriptures, there's a word, sapurisa, meaning a person of integrity, someone whose inner self and outer actions align, regardless of who's watching. To be a sapurisa is to live in a way where your conscience, not your circumstances, makes your decisions. But why does it matter? Why should we care about integrity when the world seems to reward cunning, shortcuts, and appearances? Because, and this is something the Buddha understood more than 2,500 years ago, every choice we make isn't just a decision for the moment. It's a stroke on the canvas of our character. And sooner or later the picture will show. You see, life isn't built on the big, dramatic moments we imagine. It's shaped in those invisible seconds, those tiny, unrecorded decisions, when no one's around to praise or punish us. That's where our true self is born. Think about a river. You can't see each droplet, yet over time, those countless unseen drops carve valleys, shape landscapes, and nourish forests. Our actions, especially the ones no one witnesses, are the droplets of character that shape the rivers of our lives. Buddhism teaches that everything we do, say, and think leaves a trace in the mind, like footprints in soft earth. This is known as karma, not some cosmic scoreboard in the sky, but a natural law of cause and effect within our own hearts. A dishonest act plants seeds of dishonesty. A noble act plants seeds of clarity, strength, and peace. And integrity, it's the gardener that decides which seeds get to grow. Now you might wonder, what about temptation? If desire is so natural, if shortcuts are so easy, if everyone else seems to be bending the rules, isn't it foolish to hold on to integrity? It's a fair question, because let's be honest, temptation doesn't knock on your door dressed as a villain. It often arrives disguised as opportunity or convenience or something that feels like harmless fun. A little white lie, a tiny betrayal, a shortcut that seems to hurt no one. But every time we trade integrity for temporary gain, we chip away at something irreplaceable, our own inner peace. There's a saying in the Dhammapada, better it is to conquer oneself than to win 1,000 battles. Why? Because no external victory can protect you from the storm inside when you've betrayed your own values. And this is where modern life gets tricky. Today, we're more connected and more anonymous than ever. You can insult someone behind a screen. You can spread lies with a click. You can cheat an algorithm, dodge responsibility, or vanish into a crowd. But the one person you can never hide from is yourself. Buddhism teaches that the real judge of your actions isn't the world. It's your own mind. And the mind, when burdened with guilt, regret, or shame, becomes restless, anxious, and heavy. This is what the Buddha called dukkha, a state of inner suffering born not from fate, but from the choices we make against our own nature. On the other hand, when we act with integrity, even in the hardest moments, the mind becomes light, clear, fearless. And that clarity, that quiet, unshakable peace, is worth more than any temporary gain. I once heard a story from a forest monastery in Thailand. A young monk was walking alone in the woods when he stumbled upon a precious gemstone. It shimmered in the sunlight, a fortune resting in the mud. No one else around. The monk could have taken it, sold it, disappeared into a life of luxury. But instead he picked it up, cleaned it carefully, and placed it on a stone ledge where its owner might return for it. When asked later why he didn't keep it, the monk smiled gently and said, "The gem would only shine in my hand, but peace shines in my heart forever." That's the essence of integrity. It's not about denying pleasure or avoiding risk. It's about choosing the kind of person you want to be in every invisible moment. Because here's the secret. The universe may seem indifferent, but your own mind is always listening. And in the end, it's not about what the world remembers of you. It's about whether you can rest your head on the pillow at night and know, truly know, that you honored your deepest values. So the question isn't whether temptation will come. It will. It always does. The real question is, when no one's watching, what kind of person will you choose to be? And that single, invisible choice, made in silence, made in darkness, made when no one sees, will echo longer than any applause and weigh more than any trophy. Integrity isn't a prize for saints. It's a daily practice for anyone brave enough to choose it. And once you understand that, you start to see temptation in a different light. Not as the enemy, but as the test that reveals what you're truly made of. Because while temptation offers you the world, integrity offers you yourself. And that is a trade worth making. It's strange, isn't it? How something as small as a passing thought, a fleeting image, a simple word can suddenly pull us in like a tide. 1 minute you're steady, focused, clear. The next temptation stirs and it feels as if some invisible hand tugs at your heart. But what is temptation really? Most people think of it as something external, a forbidden fruit, a seductive voice, a glittering offer. But if you look deeper through the lens of Buddhist wisdom, you'll realize temptation doesn't live out there. It lives inside us. And what it really does is reveal the shape of our desires. In Pali, the ancient language of the Buddha's teachings, there's a word, tanha. It means craving. Not simple wanting, we all want things, but that restless, burning urge that says, I must have this. I can't be happy without it. And it comes in many forms. The craving for pleasure, the craving for recognition, the craving for power, the craving to escape discomfort. Every temptation you've ever faced is simply a disguise worn by one of these cravings. A monk once described it perfectly. Desire is like drinking salty water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. And that's what makes temptation so dangerous. Not because it offers something bad, but because it awakens an endless hunger. You chase one indulgence, it feels good for a moment, and then it vanishes, leaving a sharper emptiness behind. It's a cycle, a trap, and it's ancient. The Buddha, more than 25 centuries ago, described 3 core poisons that shape our suffering: craving, aversion, and ignorance. Temptation plays with all 3. It dangles craving like a jewel. It stirs aversion to what we have, making it feel dull, lacking, unworthy. And it cloaks the truth in ignorance, so we forget the cost of what we're reaching for. But here's the secret modern life rarely admits. It's not desire itself that ruins us. It's the way we become possessed by it. Desire can be beautiful. The desire to learn, the desire to grow, the desire to protect those you love. But when desire blinds you, when it warps your integrity, hijacks your peace, makes you betray your own values, that's when it becomes a chain. Think about this. Temptation doesn't need to overpower you. It just needs to distract you long enough for you to forget who you are. And the world today is designed for exactly that. Algorithms that learn your weaknesses. Advertisements tailored to your secret cravings. Endless scrolls of curated lives making you believe you lack something essential. It's no longer a serpent in a garden. It's a notification on your screen. But Buddhism teaches that temptation isn't the enemy. It's a teacher, a mirror reflecting the shape of your attachments. When you feel temptation, don't just ask, what do I want right now? Ask, what part of me is so restless, so unsatisfied, that it believes this thing will complete me? Because every temptation carries a message, not about the object of your desire, but about the condition of your heart. Is it lonely? Is it anxious? Is it seeking escape? Is it desperate to matter, to be seen, to feel worthy? And once you see that clearly, the craving itself begins to loosen. You no longer fight temptation like an enemy. You observe it like a passing storm. There's an old Zen saying, "You cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." Temptation will rise, desire will flare. The mind will reach, ache, imagine, but you don't have to follow every impulse. You can watch, you can pause. You can smile at the mind's old tricks and say, "Ah, I know you." And in that moment, something powerful happens. You reclaim your freedom, because true freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's having the strength to choose what truly serves you. And here's the thing, most of us don't realize how many of our decisions are made not by wisdom, but by momentary craving. That extra drink you didn't need. The cruel word you regret. The shady shortcut you convinced yourself was harmless. Temptation shapes us when we aren't paying attention. It carves grooves in the mind, habits in the heart. And over time, those little choices, unnoticed, unexamined, build the person we become. This is why the Buddha placed such emphasis on mindfulness, not to turn life into some rigid, joyless discipline, but to give us the awareness to see temptation rise and the space to choose differently. A mindful person isn't someone who never feels desire. It's someone who sees desire clearly, understands its nature, and acts from wisdom, not impulse. Because every temptation is a doorway. One path leads to a fleeting pleasure followed by regret. The other leads to clarity, strength, and peace. And the beautiful thing is, that choice is always yours. You don't have to be a monk in a cave to master this. You just need to notice the shape of your cravings, to ask yourself in the heat of the moment, is this really what I want, or is it just a passing wave? Most temptations lose their power the second you stop believing their promises. And when you learn to sit with discomfort, to bear the ache of unfulfilled craving without reacting, something extraordinary happens. You discover a joy deeper than any temporary pleasure, a joy born from self-respect, from freedom, from knowing you were not conquered by your impulses. That is real strength. And it's in those quiet victories, those unseen, ordinary moments where you chose integrity over craving, that a peaceful, unshakable life is built. Because the nature of temptation is to promise you the world and leave you emptier than before. But the nature of wisdom is to offer you yourself. And once you've tasted that, nothing else compares. There's a quiet kind of strength, not the strength to dominate, not the strength to control others, but the strength to stay true to yourself when no one's watching. And in a world so loud with temptation, that kind of strength feels rare. But it doesn't have to be. Because long before social media, before endless opinions, before the noise of modern life, the Buddha understood this human struggle, the endless war between craving and conscience, and he offered a shield. Not a shield made of steel or stone, but of simple, timeless principles. 5 precepts, 5 vows, 5 promises you quietly make to yourself, not to please others, not to win approval, but to protect the peace within your own heart. They're called Panika Sila in Pali, and they aren't commandments barked from on high. They're choices, a gentle discipline, a way of moving through life that shields you not just from external harm, but from betraying your own soul. Let's remember them one by one. The first, I undertake the training to abstain from killing. Now on the surface this sounds obvious, don't take life, but it means more than refraining from violence. It's a vow to honor life in every form, to pause before acting on anger, to recognize the life in the smallest creatures, to avoid causing unnecessary harm through words, actions, or even indifference. Because every time you protect life, you protect your own humanity. The second, I undertake the training to abstain from taking what is not given. Again, more than stealing. It's about respecting boundaries, not manipulating, not taking advantage, not grasping at what isn't freely offered, be it someone's trust, time, or affections. Integrity grows in the moments you choose fairness, even when no one would know otherwise. The third, I undertake the training to abstain from sexual misconduct. This one speaks to the purity of intention, not using desire to deceive, not betraying commitments, not reducing others to objects for your craving. In a world obsessed with pleasure, this precept reminds us that desire should never cost someone else their peace. The fourth, I undertake the training to abstain from false speech. Words are powerful. They can lift, heal, destroy, or deceive. And every lie, every cruel remark, every careless comment leaves a mark, not just on others, but on the one who speaks them. This precept isn't just about avoiding lies. It's about speaking truth with compassion, knowing when to be silent, choosing honesty over convenience, because your word is your mirror. And finally, the fifth, I undertake the training to abstain from intoxicating drinks and drugs that cloud the mind. Why? Not out of puritanical fear, but because clarity matters. A clouded mind makes poor choices, and temptation preys on confusion. When your awareness is sharp, your integrity stays intact. Now here's what makes these five so powerful. They aren't meant to trap you in rigid rules. They're meant to be a shield against regret, against inner conflict, against the slow erosion of your peace. Every time you honor them, you reinforce a bond with yourself. You remind your heart that you can be trusted, and in that trust, there's incredible freedom. See, most people think freedom means doing whatever you want, but the Buddha taught something wiser. Real freedom is the ability to choose what doesn't harm you or others, even when craving tempts you otherwise. It's the freedom of self-respect, the peace of not carrying hidden shame, the strength of not having to justify actions you regret. And here's the beautiful part, you don't have to be perfect. The 5 precepts aren't a test you pass or fail. They're a compass. Some days you'll stumble, you'll speak carelessly, you'll act from craving, you'll forget yourself. And that's okay, because every sunrise is a new vow, a chance to begin again. It's not about flawless morality, it's about integrity in the moment, choosing the better path. Not because someone's watching, not because you're afraid of punishment, but because you've come to love the person you're becoming. And slowly, choice by choice, you realize something most people miss. The greatest temptation isn't a pleasure you crave. It's the urge to abandon yourself. But with these 5 simple shields in place, you stay whole. Not untouched by desire, but unswayed by it. Not a prisoner of impulse, but a master of your heart. And as that integrity takes root, you'll notice something else. Temptations lose their glitter. The hollow promises grow transparent. And what once seemed irresistible no longer owns you. Because you've built a kind of quiet, steady joy. A peace no passing pleasure can replace. And when you live from that place, not perfection but presence, you don't have to run from temptation. You see it, you smile at it, and you choose yourself every time. You've probably noticed it by now. That quiet voice inside, not the loud one screaming cravings or fears, but the gentle whisper that tugs at your sleeve when you're about to cross a line. The voice that says, "Is this really who you want to be?" In Buddhist teachings, this voice has a name. In fact, it has 2. They're called Hri and Ottappa, known as the inner guardians. 2 invisible sentinels standing watch over your heart. And though they don't shout, they are your fiercest protectors. Hri is the guardian of conscience. It's the natural sense of shame, not imposed by others, but arising from your own inner clarity. It's the part of you that feels uneasy when you act against your deeper values. Not because you fear punishment, not because someone's watching, but because you remember who you are. It's the warmth that rises in your chest when you're tempted to deceive a friend, the discomfort when you're about to say something cruel, the ache when you realize you've betrayed your own word. And while modern life often treats shame as a weakness, the Buddha saw it differently. Hri is a virtue, a guardian of dignity, a way to stay in loving relationship with yourself. Because when you lose that, when you no longer feel the sting of wrong action, something precious dies. Then there's Ottappa, the twin guardian. Where Hri guards your integrity for your own sake, Ottappa protects it for the sake of others. It's the awareness of consequences, The recognition that your actions ripple outward, touching lives you may never see. It's what makes you pause before lashing out in anger. What restrains your hand when temptation whispers, "No one will ever know." Ottappa reminds you someone will know, your family, your friends, the strangers whose paths you'll unknowingly cross, and ultimately you. It's not about living in fear of judgment. It's about understanding your place in the web of life. That what you do matters, that no choice is isolated, that integrity isn't just personal, it's collective. Together, Hri and Ottappa form a sacred balance. One turns your gaze inward, asking, "Will this action honor the person you wish to be?" The other turns your gaze outward, asking, "Will this action harm or heal the world you share?" When these two guardians are alive in you, temptation loses its power. Because desire thrives in blindness, it feeds on forgetfulness. But Hri and Ottappa keep you awake, and you don't have to be a monk in the forest or a hermit on a mountain to feel them. They appear in the small, unnoticed moments. When you're alone with a choice no one will see. When the easy, selfish option is right there. And yet, something within you hesitates. That hesitation isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's the ancestors of your own heart rising up to say, "You are better than this." It's the part of you that remembers the cost of regret, the weight of unspoken guilt, and the quiet dignity of restraint. And every time you listen, every time you let Hri and Ottappa guide you, you grow stronger. Not in the eyes of the world, but in the one place that matters most, your own. And here's something remarkable. Modern science is only just beginning to confirm what ancient wisdom knew. Studies show that people who cultivate a healthy sense of moral shame and social conscience are not only happier, but more resilient, more trusted, and less prone to self-destructive behaviors. The Buddha knew this. He didn't demand perfection. He knew desire would call your name 1,000 times, but he trusted these two guardians within you. And so should you. Because even in your darkest moments, even when temptation roars and discipline feels distant, those gentle protectors never leave. You may drown out their voices, you may ignore their warnings, but deep down you always know, you always feel. And the beautiful thing is, it's never too late to answer them. Never too late to pause, take a breath, and ask, what kind of person do I want to be when no one's watching? Because every craving passes, every temptation fades, but the person you become stays. And it's Hri and Ottappa who quietly shape that person, not by force, not by fear, but through the quiet, steady reminder. You are not your impulses, you are not your mistakes, you are the choices you make next. And when those choices are made with integrity, the world and your own heart becomes a little brighter. We tell ourselves stories, small ones, big ones, silent ones we never say out loud. It's harmless, everyone does it. No one will get hurt, I deserve this. We craft these tales not because we're evil, but because it's easier to soften a lie than to face its weight. And yet every dishonest act leaves a mark, not always on the outside, but always on the inside. The Buddha spoke often about karma not as some cosmic scorekeeper, but as a natural law, a simple truth. Every action leaves a trace, a ripple in the vast pond of your life. When you speak with kindness, the ripple carries warmth. When you act with cruelty, it carries harm. And dishonesty is a special kind of ripple, because its consequences are rarely immediate. They're silent, subtle, and devastating. When you lie even a little, something inside you fractures, a hairline crack in the mirror of your integrity. At first, it seems invisible. You move on. No one notices, no damage you can see, but the crack remains. And here's the danger: lies breed more lies, not just to others, but to yourself. You begin to justify, you reshape your memory, you dull the sharp edges of guilt. And with each act of dishonesty, you become a little more distant from who you truly are. The Buddha taught that this is where true suffering begins, not from punishment, but from disconnection, a slow erosion of inner peace. Because even if no one catches you, you catch yourself. Your subconscious remembers, the body remembers. The sleepless nights, the tightness in your chest, the quiet dread of being exposed, even if exposure never comes. And over time, these invisible consequences multiply. They show up as anxiety, as restlessness, as a gnawing sense of unworthiness. Modern psychology has a name for this: cognitive dissonance. The unbearable tension when your actions contradict your values. But 2,500 years ago, the Buddha simply called it dukkha, suffering. And it's one of the most dangerous forms, because you don't always realize where it's coming from. You might blame stress, your job, your relationships, but beneath it all, it's the weight of your own dishonesty quietly dragging you down. And here's a truth most people never admit. We don't lie because we're bad. We lie because we're afraid of consequences, afraid of judgment, afraid we won't get what we want or we'll lose what we have. But what the Buddha gently revealed is that the real consequence is never out there. It's within, because every time you betray the truth, you train your mind to distrust itself. You weaken the foundation of your own peace. And ironically, the thing you were trying to avoid, suffering, creeps in anyway. So what's the way out? It's not about punishing yourself. It's about seeing clearly, recognizing that the cost of dishonesty is too high, not because others will find out, but because you will. The good news is, karma is not fate, it's dynamic. It shifts with every choice you make. And integrity, once broken, can be rebuilt by telling the truth when it's hard, by owning mistakes without excuses, by choosing discomfort over dishonor. Each honest word is a repair. Each act of courage, a stitch in the fabric of your being. And the beauty of karma is that it works both ways. Just as deception breeds suffering, honesty cultivates peace. Not the fleeting kind that comes from getting away with something, but the enduring calm of a heart at ease. Because when you stop lying to others, you stop lying to yourself. And when you stop lying to yourself, you stop fearing the world. You walk lighter, you breathe easier, and you discover that the greatest freedom isn't in hiding your flaws, but in facing them openly, humbly, without shame. The Buddha often said, "There is no fire like lust, no grip like hatred, no net like delusion, no river like craving. But if I may add, there's no prison quite like dishonesty, and no liberation more profound than truth, even if it shakes you, even if it costs you, even if it leaves you vulnerable. Because at the end of your days, what will matter isn't how well you hid, but how deeply you lived in alignment with the person you were meant to be." And integrity, messy, imperfect, but sincere, is the only foundation strong enough to hold the weight of a meaningful life. That's the real karma, the invisible consequences you choose and the invisible peace you reclaim. Every day we stand at a crossroads, tiny choices, seemingly insignificant decisions, moments so ordinary they barely register, but within them, the fabric of our integrity is either strengthened or frayed. You see, temptation doesn't always announce itself. It whispers, it disguises itself as opportunity, as convenience, as just this once. A shortcut at work, a flirtation outside your relationship, a white lie to avoid conflict. Scrolling past a homeless man with averted eyes, it's everywhere, and it's constant. We live in a world engineered to pull us away from ourselves. Billboards promising happiness, algorithms feeding desire, cultures rewarding appearances over substance. So how do you hold your ground? How do you practice integrity when everything around you seduces you to abandon it? The Buddha's answer was not to run away, not to retreat to mountaintops or hide in monasteries, but to learn to walk through the world awake. Because temptation isn't the problem, it's your relationship with it. And the truth is, integrity isn't something you have, it's something you do. A daily practice, an inner discipline built one moment at a time. So let's talk about how. The first practice is awareness. Notice when temptation arrives, not with judgment but with curiosity. Oh, there it is, the urge to cut corners, the itch to exaggerate, the hunger to impress. The moment you see it, you've created space, a pause between impulse and action, And in that pause, freedom lives. The second practice is asking better questions. Instead of, will I get away with this? Try, who do I become if I choose this? Because every act, no matter how small, is a vote for the person you're becoming. Will you cast your vote for courage, for kindness, for honesty, or will you trade a piece of yourself for a passing gain? The third practice is remembering your values. It's astonishing how often we forget what truly matters when we're in the heat of temptation. Keep your values visible. Write them down. Speak them aloud. Make them part of your daily language. Not as a performance, but as a reminder. Because a life without a compass is easily swept away by the tides. The fourth practice is learning to sit with discomfort. Temptation often promises ease, but integrity demands tolerance for discomfort. The awkwardness of telling the truth, the sting of owning your mistake, the loneliness of choosing the harder path. And yet, on the other side of that discomfort is something priceless, self-respect. And no external reward compares. The fifth practice is surrounding yourself with mirrors, people who remind you who you are when you forget, friends who won't flatter you but hold you accountable. The Buddha called this Kali Macron letter 1E47 Amida noble friendship. Not just companions, but protectors of your integrity. Because you can fake it to the world, but not to the ones who truly see you. And finally, the sixth practice is compassion for yourself. You will fail, you will slip, you will lie, avoid, pretend, and that's okay. The practice isn't perfection, it's return. Each time you betray your integrity, let it be a lesson, not a life sentence. Own it, learn from it, and begin again. Because integrity isn't measured by how few mistakes you make, but by how honestly you confront them. The Buddha never demanded flawlessness. He taught resilience, the courage to fall and rise, and in this rising over and over the heart grows strong. Temptation will always exist. Desire is part of the human condition. But you are not a prisoner to it. You are capable of conscious choice, of small, sacred rebellions against the tide, of living a life that feels clean, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. A life where you can meet your own gaze in the mirror, unafraid. And here's the secret few realize. The more you choose integrity, the easier it becomes. Not because temptation disappears, but because you change. Your taste for easy victories fades. Your appetite for self-respect grows. And what once tempted you no longer holds the same shine. The Buddha called this virya, the effort, the energy to maintain what is wholesome and abandon what is not. It's not dramatic, it's not glamorous. It's 1,000 tiny choices, each one a thread. And together those threads weave a life of quiet strength. And isn't that what we really long for? Not the absence of temptation, but the ability to walk through it, head held high, unbroken. To live in this world but not be owned by it. To be tempted and still choose yourself. And so, as this chapter closes and the night grows quiet, let this be your vow to walk awake, to choose clearly, to fall kindly, and to rise stronger, not for anyone else's approval, not for heaven's reward, but because this is the life worth living, and the only one you'll ever truly own. So here we are. At the edge of the road, we've been walking together. We've traveled through shadows and light, temptation and choice, honesty and its hidden consequences. We've spoken of ancient wisdom and modern struggle, of battles no one sees but that shape everything we become. And now it comes down to this: what kind of life will you leave behind? Because whether you intend to or not, you're always leaving something. A memory, a reputation, a ripple. The question is, will it be a story of someone who bent to the world's every whim? Or someone who, quietly and without applause, chose to live by a deeper code? You see, integrity isn't a prize you win. It's a legacy you leave. Not written in stone monuments or titles or fortunes, but in hearts you've touched, in promises you kept, in the quiet courage of your everyday choices. The Buddha once said, "Your actions are your only true belongings." When the curtain falls, when the applause fades, and the names on your business cards are forgotten, what remains is the person you've become, Not the image you crafted for others, but the you who stands alone when no one's watching. And here's what no one tells you. You don't have to be perfect to leave a beautiful legacy. You don't have to be flawless to matter. You simply have to be real, to live with your eyes open, to notice when you're pulled by the world's empty promises and gently come back to yourself. Because this world will keep tempting you, with easier paths, with louder applause, with shinier rewards. But none of it can give you what you're really searching for. The peace of knowing you honored your word, the quiet pride of having nothing to hide, the strength of standing by your values when no one else does. That's the kind of wealth you carry into your final breath. That's the kind of name that lingers long after the world forgets your face. So tonight, as this story closes, ask yourself, not what others expect of you, but what you expect of yourself. What kind of person do you want to be when no one's around to see it? When no one's there to praise or punish? When the only witness is your own heart? Because, in the end, it won't be the grand moments that define you. It will be the quiet ones, the way you treated a stranger, the choice you made when no one would know, the stand you took when it cost you something. That's your real story. And the most extraordinary thing is, you get to write it every day. Every choice, every breath. You don't need permission, you don't need perfection, just the willingness to begin, the courage to fail and rise again, and the heart to walk your path, however uncertain, with your head held high. So, what will you choose? When the next temptation comes, when the next easy way out calls your name, when the next moment demands a decision, what will you stand for? Who will you be? Because when all is said and done and the dust of your life settles, this, more than anything else, is the question that will echo through eternity. Did you choose to live true? And if you haven't yet, will you start now? The path is yours, the moment is here, and you are ready. Thank you for walking this road with me. May you walk awake, may you walk strong, may you walk kind. And when you leave this world, may it be said, here was someone who chose integrity and lived it.